Hey guys, I just want to talk a little bit about the poems that you read for today, and I want to tell you up front that I'm probably going to raise more questions than I'm going to answer with this lecture, which is a little bit unusual. Hopefully most lectures will answer more questions than it raises, but with this one I think it's really important to be asking yourself some questions as you read these, because that's going to help you lead into thesis statements and topics for your essay. So that is my intention, to raise these sorts of questions and get you thinking about these poems. And as I'm talking about them, if you sort of start getting more interested in one of the poems, that might be a signal that maybe this would be a good one to write about. So we're just going to go through the poems one at a time, sort of the way we would in a regular classroom, and then you guys will have an opportunity with your home groups this week to talk a little bit more about each of the poems. Okay? So the first one, Smith's To Carry the Child. And Smith in this poem contends that hanging on to childlike qualities will make you miserable as an adult, and that parents who baby their children as they're growing up are doing them a disservice. So I think this raises some interesting questions about where that line is between protecting and guiding your children and damaging them by being too involved and overprotective. Because it is sort of a paradox here, right? That the child comes into the world entirely helpless, dependent on the parents for everything. So you have to provide everything. You have to be protective. And then as they grow, though, there's this importance of letting them take more risks, letting them try things on their own, even if they fail. And I think that's really, really difficult for some parents. So I think the poem sort of investigates some of those issues. What are the problems? What are the long-term effects of not allowing your child to take those risks and to sort of carrying them and crippling them into adulthood? Larkin's poem, This Be the Verse, the next poem, is also about relationships, sometimes between parents and children. This is a pretty bleak poem. Hopefully not everything we read in here will be depressing. It won't all be. But this one is sort of, right? Essentially, this poem argues people make each other miserable. Our best option is to die quickly and without having children of our own. So, this seems like a pretty cynical viewpoint. The argument, though, that it presents, that problems are cyclical and often passed down from generation to generation, can be seen throughout society, right? I mean, we have some statistical evidence for this argument. But most of us have experiences in our lives and experiences with other people that would tell us that there's another side to this, right? That there's a way to break negative cycles, that there's value in having children, having those relationships, having close friendships with other people, that we don't all make each other miserable. We don't have to make each other miserable. So this poem sort of brings up the question, what is that alternative to this idea of problems being cyclical and passed down? Do we have to make the same mistakes our parents made? If your parents made problems similar to that and to carry a child, if they were overprotective, overbearing, didn't let you make your own mistakes, does that doom you? Are you going to repeat those same mistakes? Do you have to be defined by those mistakes? Or is there something else? Do we have another option? So I think those are some things that those two poems really look at. The next one, Hanging Fire. First, let's talk about what that phrase means, hang fire. It's that delay between the triggering and actual firing of a firearm. So the trigger's been pulled, but it hasn't actually fired yet. It's a very short period of time if, the gun is going off correctly. And this seems like an apt metaphor for adolescence, right? Things like hormones have started firing, that have been triggered in your life, but your adult life hasn't yet begun yet, really. Hasn't actually fired. So it's a weird mix, adolescence is, of growing up, but also being told that you have to wait on a lot of grown-up things, right? So one thing to think about in this poem is, what was that hang fire moment like for you? Most of us have some awkward teenage stories, I'm sure, of times where we wanted our adult life to begin. We feel like adults. We can handle this. And then, in the next moment, still feeling like children. And what that moment was like for you. What problems and trials this period brings. But then also, I think there's this other side. What are some advantages and opportunities during the teenage years? Because you know, in a lot of ways you do have more abilities than before, but you don't always have all of the responsibilities of being a full-blown adult. So can those teenage years actually be used for something constructive, something helpful? Are there advantages that maybe are even hard to see at the time, but looking back we can see and maybe help others see when they're in that situation? The next poem also deals with adolescence. Another poem about those awkward teenage years that most of us may not remember so fondly. This poem is sort of interesting in that it's observing. This poem is sort of observing this school dance. Okay? And so what question this poem raises for some people is it sexist to observe? Because the author makes some pretty clear statements on gender roles here, right? Girls are acting this way, boys are acting this way, but she also just seems to be reporting what she's observing. So is there something hardwired into us that makes us behave in certain gendered ways? And if so, should we really be that concerned about that fact? Is it just part of our DNA, something maybe to be embraced instead of worried about? And so I think it'll be interesting to hear different views on this poem in your groups, because, you know, is this a school dance that you're familiar with? Did you see this in your own experience? Or did you have a totally different experience where the gender roles were less clear or even reversed? Is this a generational thing? Is some of this going away? Or do we still see, you know, girls often prefer princesses and tutus, and boys often prefer trucks and footballs? Is there something sort of hardwired into us? How much of this is nature? How much is nurture? How much needs to be embraced? How much needs to be worked against? So I think that can provide some sort of interesting conversation in your group, and also some interesting paper topics as well. Now the next poem, a very sad poem, from the Diary of an Almost 4-Year-Old. And this poem has such an interesting mix, I think, of wisdom and maturity and ignorance. That we see this wisdom and maturity in this girl knowing that her crime, definitely in quotation marks, she committed no crime, was somehow looking at this soldier in the wrong way. And she feels bad for this baby, this 9-month-old baby who couldn't know better than to look at the soldier and who was also shot. They've both been punished for this, but she feels bad for the baby because, you know, she's had 4 years and this baby's only had 9 months. So she has this beautiful wisdom and maturity, but also this ignorance, right? Not understanding what this war is meaning, really. Also not knowing that a glass eye won't give her her vision back. She thinks once she has that glass eye, she'll be able to see. Even if it's a little distorted, she'll still be able to see through it. And I think this mix of wisdom and ignorance contributes to us admiring this child, right? Admiring her for her wisdom, but also feeling bad about the situation because she is so incredibly young. At 4, she's having to wrestle with these huge issues, losing her sight in a war that isn't her fault, where she didn't do anything wrong. So we end up with this really touching poem with an incredibly likable narrator. And I think one thing to think about with this poem is what perspective it brings to the other poems about adolescence and about growing up in this section. To carry the child, this be the verse, hang fire. Do those problems look smaller or less important in light of this poem? Do we sort of give those, you know, well, those are first world problems now, you know, you don't quite like the way you look, you know, maybe your parents were a little overprotective. Maybe that's not such a big deal when you look at what people in other parts of the world are dealing with. Or, you know, do all problems sort of need to be dealt with? Do you need to deal with the problems of where you live? Or is there something to learn from these problems that are going on in other areas? Can it give us a different perspective on things we're facing? So I think those are some interesting things to talk about with that poem. Now the next 2 poems focus on a different topic sort of than the other ones have, but they're similar to one another. So Feldman's My Century and Reese's The Manhattan Project both deal with the atom bomb. In the first, in My Century, we have this sort of central paradox. The year the narrator was born, humans found a way to destroy the whole world, right? This isn't a sci-fi idea. This is true. They invented the atom bomb the year this this narrator was born. Never before had we had the power to do that, right? So how strange then for your life to begin at a time when all life could be wiped out, right? So something to think about with this poem is what happened the year you were born, and how might that color how you see the world? Maybe it was something really great that's going to make your life a whole lot better that came along just at the right time, right when you were being born, this sort of amazing breakthrough came. Maybe it's something negative that that would color how you see it. Or maybe it's something that you're sort of ambivalent about, not sure yet if it's positive or negative, maybe has some positive parts, but could be used for negative. So that's something to think about, looking into a little bit what happened the year you were born and how that might color how you see things. Now the last poem, Reese's poem, The Manhattan Project, also a poem about the atom bomb. This poem spans 3 generations. Okay? The first generation, which is the narrator's grandfather, was involved in creating the atom bomb. The next generation, the father of the narrator, watches this process and sort of takes in the consequences. And then the third generation, the narrator, wonders at his father's silence about this issue specifically, but also in general. And so I think this poem is really focused on those moments of silence, what's happening in those times when we can't seem to connect to our loved ones about this important topic that we might be interested in, or we might see shaped this person, but we don't really have access to that experience. So I think this raises some interesting questions about silence. Is there something to be learned from silence? Why is someone silent? Why is this particular person, the father in the poem, silent? What does the silence of some mean for your own voice? So if others are silent by choice, or maybe not by choice, what can you do with your own voice to help? Are there things that you're silent about, and why? Can silence be a form of communication? Can we learn something from the silence, or does communication have to involve words or some sort of interaction? So some things to think about with that. I think that raises some interesting questions about our own voices and our own silence. So hopefully you guys enjoyed some of these poems. I know not everybody's going to like all of them, but hopefully you found some that you can sort of start connecting with, and hopefully your discussions in your groups will help with that as well. And of course, if you have any questions about the poems or something that comes up in your group, don't hesitate to let me know. I'm happy to talk about these further. One of the things I love to do is to talk about literature with you guys, so I'm always excited for that opportunity. So let me know if you have any questions, and see you at the next lecture.